Hi there, and thank you for clicking on my video. Today we're going to be talking about the new puncture, the new cold, and modding with respect to frostbite. To those of you that are just trying to run the arcane, or just want to know puncture cold, what do I do? Listen, if you're running a primer and you're thinking about like primary damage or anything like that, you basically just have a buff. Getting the like arcane cumber on the secondary, running a primer build. It's just a straight up buff, a little bit more crit chance, a little bit more crit damage. You're just going to be doing more damage, which is pretty nice. If you want to passively trigger the arcane, a sentinel with a verglass is super easy to maintain the stacks. Just make sure you haven't modded it for like viral or something like that to get rid of the cold. That's innate on it. And the other thing, if you're worried about like thinking about changes or anything like that, the other thing you're going to have to consider with it is because of a couple of incarnons that exist. The fact is that it's going to mess with rivens. So for the couple of weapons that really care about crit chance and making sure their crit chance is as low as possible, you have to take into account the puncture increasing your crit chance. Now, it's not going to hurt your damage too much, honestly, but it's more for the people paying those hyper premiums for rivens. The definition of what a god roll is has definitely changed on some of these. You're gonna have to make sure to know what numbers you need to hit, incorporating the puncture crit chance increase. It's going to be the difference between a riven being worth thousands and a riven not being worth much. Or at least like something like 300-400 plat versus like something that's worth like 5k, right? Because it's like, say on like a glaive, right, with like a heavy attack, there is a massive price difference between a glaive riven that can get you to 3x and one that's like one short of 3x. Those are two different stratospheres of plat amounts. If you have one that can get you to 3x, it's worth way more. So when you're doing builds for those and you're buying those god roll rivens, you have to make sure to add the extra crit chance in. So you're going to need to know your numbers. The one that's mostly going to hurt you is going to be the fell arcs. Because that's still pretty common to not use the Incarnon, even though I ran a level cap with the Incarnon 2 weeks ago, the Incarnon fell arcs, and was using the Incarnon form of the fell arcs, and even at like 3k 4k I was still killing. I didn't check again at level cap, but obviously the meta way to use something like the fell arcs, which does have puncture, is to use it in its native form, not the Incarnon form. Obviously that's not going to be a big issue on something like the Fenmore, right? Because its Incarnon form is puncture slash. So if you're doing Demolist killing, well, it's basically just a slash weapon. Let's be honest here. But in terms of those god rolls, like, you need to make sure to keep into account and maybe adjust and not run encumber on your primer. Maybe go with like, say if you're like using like a new core or something like that, maybe go back to your bread and butter, like viral heat or corrosive build or whatever you had before, to not use encumber, because encumber can proc the cold and puncture, so it could mess up your damage pretty bad on something like the Fenmore, because it scales off of the innate damage or the innate crit chance, so it's going to be scaling off of 20 is what I was testing and seeing. These changes to these elements is still pretty new, so maybe that's something that might get fixed, but as of right now, especially with all the Sevagoths and everything running around. It's kind of difficult to keep that crit chance at 0. So just keep in mind when you're thinking about, modding with respect to puncture, cold, and frostbite, you might not be sitting at 0 as much as you want. So if you're buying god rolls for those weapons, especially the Felarks, there might be a noob trap waiting there for you. But anyway, the rest of this video is going to be modding with respect to those. That's enough of a warning. So if you're just looking for a little tidbit and then you want to bounce, you're out of here. So how can we get corrosive puncture in as easy of an advantage as possible? And there's probably a pretty good hint. It's what I'm using right now. If you know what the coloring is of it, you know that this is a cold Kuva comb. I farmed this up just for this video to show an example of it. With puncture and crit chance, or with puncture giving crit chance, cold giving crit damage, and frostbite being multi-shot crit damage, and due to the nature of the mods on the Kuva comb, if you actually want to try running this over, say, like a Merciless, all things considered, I will say this arcane is easier. It's at no point in time is it stronger than, say, like a Merciless or a Deadhead. If you're able to trigger Deadhead with whatever your weapon is, and you're not doing like a slash build, I will say this: it is easier to maintain this arcane, and if it falls off, especially with something like the Kuva comb, it ain't that hard to get the stacks back. So you're going to lose some damage, you're going to gain some compensation, so the damage almost breaks even. I mean, technically you get a little bit ahead, but but you gain ahead in terms of raw damage, but you lose a dot. So I'm not really too happy with that. But in terms of raw damage builds, I could see this arcane being significantly more relevant in circuit runs because of the decrees that are available. There's the decree that causes a cold proc on crit, and what is it? It gives you bonus damage of crit on your primaries. That means this arcane is basically going to be permanently stacked. So there would be a build path that would be potentially associated with circuit. But let's talk about like a more realistic, usable, even like steel path worthy. I don't see this being really usable in terms of like level cap. Like there's just better setups. But let's go over the build. This is the best example, and I'll show some for like a rifle. And there's one big reason. If you're looking for like a quote unquote recommendation of like, you just want to mess around with it and you want to know what's like the best place to start. Honestly, the Kuva comb. I've tried this on a bunch of different weapons, and the Kuva comb does really well. So the build that we're actually going to try to go for is actually going to be a corrosive cold build. The flex slot, quote unquote, is actually going to be Hunter Munitions. I did put this on here, so I did have some sort of dot. But that being said, you could also remove Shotgun Barrage. But okay, let's go over the build. We're not going to be doing new bro builds with this. Because one, it's a Kuva comb. Two, where you get frostbite from is kind of a late game area. So you're not really going to be running around on Earth, Venus, or Mars with frostbite. Unless you literally get into the game and it's like a Smurf account and you just wail for it instantly. In which case, good luck, keep wailing, because I'm not going to cover it. So what's the point of this build? It's a lot of coping, to be honest. But the damage actually ends up being not that bad, because we're running Hunter Munitions. The build is basically prime point blank, savvy, hell, critical deceleration. I went with the prime charge shell mod to lean as heavy as possible and to get as much of that elemental multiplier as possible. Toxic barrage, just to get the status chance up a little bit more. It jumps from 162 to 216 with just toxic barrage. Obviously, savvy was on there for the 162. And shotgun barrage. This weapon needs fire rate so badly. I even find myself running barrage and tempo just to get it to feel, just a little bit more snappy. And I can't recommend prime shotgun ammo mutation more because of the amount of bullets you need to be able to pick up with this. Obviously, you can try to run vigilante supplies. You will notice the increased crit tiers. Like, you will be able to see them, but it's more because of the amount of multi-shots you're going to have. Because remember, now if we're running frostbite and we're actually modding with respect to it, we are actually going to have a shit ton of multi-shot. Other than that, the build's pretty simple. It's a little bit of flexibility. So if you notice, this is the main reason why I'm recommending using shotguns, is literally because of the modding that's available. The shotguns don't have good crit damage mods, right? Ravage is 60%. And most people, if you've completed the star chart, there's a good chance you have Ravage, but it's not guaranteed. You might actually get primed Ravage before you get regular Ravage, depending on what the barrel rotations are, and also just sign of the times, because TennoCon is like going on, right? So in order to slot this, it saves you a 14 capacity mod. But we got to make sure we get something for it, right? So the bonus is the Arcane actually gives 10% more crit damage. It gives 120 crit damage, and Night was 2.2. Pardon, I think that's 90. Yeah, 80 and a quarter, so 10. So, okay, 90. So it gives 90% multi-shot, but it replaces this primed mod super easy. So if you're doing like a free-to-play, this might be the penny saver Arcane for shotguns if you want to run them. And you can proc cold relatively easily. Because you still have prime point blank. So you're getting... It is a bit of a DPS hit, but the bonus is we do get a little bit of compensation back because we're gaining a dot, or we're gaining another element, right? Because normally when you run like the Kuva Comb, you'll run like viral with Hunter munitions. I also have a Kuva Comb that's innate heat, but is still heavily leaning into corrosive, and the heat only exists for the armor shred. But when you get a cold Kuva Comb, you can actually run this build, where it is a pure slash build. I don't even mod for the cold. So you would then gain your primed Ravage back for the crit damage, and then it would be a normal slash build that would be boosted pretty high, and you would gain the extra savvy stack, right? Because normally you wouldn't want any elementals... and any elemental weightings on anything like this. Well, the impact Kuva Comb kind of sucks, and because of its fire rate, and the lack of impact to slash mod, you're basically stuck doing something like this. Like, you could do impact and then maybe roll for like a negative impact riven or something like that, but it's too much work. So now you would go and look for a Kuva Comb, because it seems like the rolls for the Kuva weapons and the Tenet weapons have been way lower. I actually looked out with this, and it was like 40%. But most of my Kuva weapons, because I went through and finished all of the ephemeras for the like the Kuva ephemeras and the sister ephemeras, um, and I wasn't getting a lot of high percentage rolls. Like a lot of them were like 20 to 20 or like 25 to 30%. Obviously not 20. So in this circumstance, it could actually work out as a benefit to you. A super low percentage, it keeps that weighting low. So you actually end up getting a shit ton of slash procs. So it turns it into a proper slash goblin. And because of critical deceleration, which is practically mandatory, because blunderbuss is 90%, which sucks. This 50%, you actually get to add the extra 25%. Now, it's not going to scale off of that, right? It's going to be 25% of 19. So basically, it's going to be another 5. But another 5 almost puts you at 2/3. And because of the multi-shot, you're going to be triggering 3 to 4 slash procs each time it sends a volley of bullets forward. And that'll still give you 17, 18, 20k slash ticks, right? Because it's a hit scan weapon. So it still ends up working out pretty well. But this would be more of a coping build where you still want to do like a cold build, but you want it to be like a slash Kuva comb. Though actually this wouldn't hurt your dismember percentage, so you could still use this as like a desecrate weapon, which was the original meme for this, a wall of bullets breaking enemies apart. But because of the arcane, even though you do lose some base damage, both things that this scales on and contributes to benefit slash heavily. So let's check out the damage on this one first. And then for the like a proper slash dot build. Now we've got tons of status chance. Let's go ahead and get a couple stacks. So lots of 4 digits. I think there was one 5-digit. Yeah, there was 11k. Let's get a headshot. 17k. It's good enough for Star Chart. It's good enough for base Steel Path, right? Obviously, that's not going to carry you to level cap. But the puncture and cold gives a slightly additional scaling. Obviously, running crit damage helps a ton compared to the other build, where this one runs way more heavy into raw damage. And Hunter Munitions is just to give us a dot. Because we did the cold build, or the cold Kuva comb, we don't have access to like a heat dot or something like that. So compare it to that one. Think about the damage we were just doing, where it was like 17k on like a headshot, 3k on like a dot, 7k, like basic standard 4-figure slash dots. It's nothing insane. But the benefit, and one of the few praises that I can really sing about this, is because we're now modded for corrosive cold, running up into an elite unit with alloy doesn't hurt as bad. Because we have cold on it. Obviously the Panzer's still helping us out, the slash dot is still helping us out. But these guys have alloy armor. And it doesn't hurt as bad as if you went, in terms of raw damage, it doesn't hurt as bad hitting a alloy armor when you're modded for corrosive, because you don't have any elemental weakness bonuses. So that's probably the biggest benefit, if you will. I mean, obviously it's still going to hurt, especially with our corrosive weighting. But like on the rifle build for this, the cold's weighted a lot more, so it doesn't hurt as bad. So, food for thought. This was the build I've been running around testing with. Um, this does really good for all the steel path, especially against the Grineer. It's a raw damage build. I wouldn't use this against like Corpus or Corrupted, like Orokin enemies that have, because the issue is nullifiers, right? I realized pretty quickly that Arcane Tempo doesn't count nullifier hits toward tempo. And I guess I had just never noticed it. Like, that's something that I would notice, but I just had never noticed it until the enemies started getting like tanky enough where I needed the crit to be able to keep the tempo up. So I'm going to say Shotgun Barrage is like a required mod. Normally I would say like, oh, well, we can just shove fire rate onto the frame with like a tempo or acceleration, right? I would say go double fire rate for this weapon to just get the raw damage up, get the spool up faster. You guys know the deal. And Hunter Munitions is a nice little mod to have. If you want to go full raw damage, there you go. Use the double 165s. Boost your raw damage up way higher. And let me show you what that looks like. And this is part of the reason why I was recommending the Kuva Comb. It's a cheap little, it's not cheap necessarily, but like, because of the capacity that you gain from being a Kuva weapon, you really don't have to throw a bunch of Forma at this. So even with... Actually, I've got acceleration on. Hold on one second. If you run Tempo Barrage, the DPS is actually pretty good. But just keep in mind with the nullifiers, that shit can hurt and it can kill you if you're not paying attention. Alright, first kill's the worst. A little baby slash dots. And now that we're stacked up, it's not too bad. Like, obviously, once everything's stacked up, you can see it shreds. Like, it's the Kuva Comb, it's doing Kuva Comb things. But the issue is you'll never run into an issue where you don't have any base damage. Like, say with Merciless, which is what people tend to go for, even though Deadhead or Dexterity is probably the best bet for longer runs. Merciless is just the reload speed and the base damage, especially on like punch-through weapons or like AoE weapons. It's pretty easy to keep up, right? But using this style of build, especially with a shotgun, your base damage isn't the thing that's jumping up and down, right? If you don't have Prime Chilling Grasp, then just leave the cold where it is. Throw Ravage back on to get your crit damage back. But if you want the elemental weighting and you're willing to shoot for a second or two to get your crit damage back, or if you don't have Ravage, you know, it is what it is. But this way, your base damage is always there. And the things that's scaling is something that scales on top of the Galvanize mod. And crit damage, because you have so much multi-shot and so much status chance, you're going to be proccing cold relatively quickly. So if you're looking for a weapon with something different, like a slightly different build path, this is not going to cap in its current form. Especially with cold being the hanging element, but just for something to run around and beat up the star chart with, this will get it done. Let's talk about the rifle build. And the weapon I was testing this out with was the Stalta. And I actually didn't mind it too much. If you're going for like a raw damage build, one of the things that I did find pretty nice about this is obviously there's the understanding that you're taking a base damage hit, right? This can act as like a secondary backup arcane to Merciless. And I think that in terms of like actually genuinely modding this, I think this is where its benefit really sits at, right? This will allow you the ability, because you're going to need to put base damage back on the modding, right? Like a mod for it. But the thing is it's easier to get crit damage on a brand new weapon, like say on a Riven, when it has a low dispo, than it is to get enough multi-shot and crit chance for you to give a shit about. And crit damage, you can recover the crit damage, but the base damage, you can get that at a pretty decent amount. But because of how hard Rivens are to get something that's usable, this will open you up to something like giving you the flexibility. So if you get a Riven that has base damage, crit chance on it, and it wouldn't really count as like a proper god roll, this can be the flexibility where you can run the Riven plus base damage and you still have 300 or 360 or whatever it is, where it's not that much of a hit, and then enjoy more multi-shot and crit damage from the arcane. So I think that's probably like the biggest thing in terms of what this is going to be used for, is for the Riven rollers. Keep this in the back of your mind, because on low dispo Rivens, you can recover with a base damage mod plus base damage on a Riven. You can get back up to like 200, 300, right? Especially with Serration being 165, you could probably get a Riven with 100 base damage on it. But if you're trying to go for the 3+, like this Stalta is like a great Riven, but it's not a god roll because it doesn't have a negative. So 119 base damage, if I were to take this out and put a Serration back on and save the mod for crit damage, because it's 120 crit damage on the arcane, that can be my quote-unquote slot for base damage if I have a Riven. Well, this puts me at, what, 165 and 119. So it's going to be 184.2. Or, sorry, 282. Hold on, I'll do the math real quick. 165 plus 119.2. Okay, so between the Riven and Serration, right, I have 284 damage, base damage, modded. Well, that is obviously less than 360, but I'm not losing the entire arcane now. Now it's an issue of just numbers. So where before I was getting 360 base damage from the arcane only when it had all of its stacks, and Merciless falls off a ton. If you're not actively killing like all the time, you're generally running around with like not all of your stacks. So you might have like 10 stacks or like 9 stacks or something like that. Deadhead, you can run around with all 3 if you can aim. And Dexterity's pretty easy to keep up also. But Merciless falls off really fast at 4 seconds a stack. Like you're not really using all 12 of those stacks all the time. You can get up there and maintain it if you're doing like solo play, but if you're running like the Zeramin or something like that, you're probably not getting all of your stacks all the time. So the Frostbite has a much better fall off. It lasts for 12 seconds, and if you have a Riven that has base damage on it and you're willing to mod Serration back on, this becomes more favorable in my eyes than running like a Deadhead setup. Well, maybe not a Deadhead. The multiplier on Deadhead's pretty nice. But maybe like a Dexterity Arcane. And so you can keep your dot build, where maybe you wouldn't be able to rely on Deadhead so much because of the dots. This would be a good middle ground. Now, you would have to mod and bullet hose cold. But if you actually got that on a Riven, it might be a nice little pocket pick. You would get the bonus, even though the Serration and the and the Riven doesn't really get me back up to 360. One of the things that does end up happening is I now have an additional element that's going to scale, or an additional status that's going to scale Galvanized Aptitude. So I gain a little bit back. So I was at like 280 with the base damage from the Riven and Serration. Because of the additional status, I gain another 80 back, and technically I'm at 364. But I'm not really going to be at 364 the entire time, right? So it depends, but even though this weapon's multiplicative. But you get the idea. Worst case scenario is that it's another element. Galvanized Aptitude scales a little bit more, but you have a lower base damage to scale off of, unless you use a Riven. So if you're thinking about actually trying this, and you're just frustrated with Merciless, I think this is probably the best way to actually use this. Alright, let's see its damage. It's a pretty basic build. This takes the spot of crit damage and Serration. So the Arcane for base damage and crit damage mod swap. So now it's a base damage mod with a crit damage Arcane, and the multi-shot is just gravy. So technically, because of the Riven, it's kind of a push. Let's get some stacks. Alright, so 8k, 6k, 3k, 25k. I saw 32. I think that was an 11 and a 16. And obviously no faction mods. I can load those up so we can get a more even comparison. And a headshot for 81, 82, 75, 52. So it's all about the same. And if you're going to be running this, and the only thing I would say stay away from, and if you think about it for a second, it makes perfect sense. Don't run this using say something like a Tonkor, because puncture and cold scale with stacks. I would highly recommend bullet hoses and weapons with maybe innate multi-shot. So say like a Telos Incarnon, like a Telos Boltor Incarnon is super juicy right now, and this just amps it even more. And this is part of the reason why I was using the comb, right? Is to get the status even higher, so it's constantly stacked at max. Because if you're using a rifle, you do rely on the punch through a little bit. But with such a slow stack, hold on, I'm still off tempo. So as long as we keep the cold weighting down, like I'm at 40 already. With this weapon, it's going to be pretty difficult to get the stacks on like a single target. So like 26k, we're using a faction mod now, 34k, 80k on a headshot, 42k on a headshot, 390k on a headshot, 166. Yeah, there's some damage here. Obviously that's on targets that aren't moving, but if you're bullet hosing headshots, right? So that was like, yeah, 410. Yeah, there's plenty of damage here. It doesn't hurt your slash procs as much as you would think, because where before you were just getting base damage and you cut your base damage essentially less than half, but because you're getting the additional multi-shot and the crit chance is sort of coping, it's the same on the rifle, but on the shotgun you're actually getting more than a prime mod, so it's a more even trade doing that. But if you wanted to do something like this, this actually feels pretty strong. I've been running with prime shred though for most of the star chart, and it's even over like the normal build where I would have like drawing a blank for a second, vital sense here and base damage up here. It still feels stronger, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that you're gaining more status increase or more damage off of the galvanized aptitude, so you are gaining a lot back. So I think this is going to be the closest thing to like a regularly running build. And obviously if you want a Forma, primed cryo goes right here for the highest multipliers. But I kind of want the status chance, to be honest. It's nice raw damage though, but if you're maybe you don't want to run like longer missions in Steel Path, but you still want to mod effectively, maybe leave it at like a 60-60 to keep the statuses, the cold status procs as nice as possible, but not to overwhelm your slash dot. So that would be my recommended build setup if you wanted to use it. If you want to do like an actual cold setup, but you still like raw damage, it's pretty clear that it seems like if you're not using the puncture and cold for a general damage boost, with like a primer, using the Tenet weapons and the Kuva weapons to get that just sort of hanging cold proc, and then running like a corrosive build, but still keeping hunter munitions, if you don't want to run faction mods, it ends up being about the same. Especially when you start incorporating Rivens and stuff like that, which a lot of the Kuva weapons are pretty cheap. Now, you could roll a Riven, and if you get like a toxin base damage Riven, all of a sudden like it's worth a damn now, right? So I wouldn't say it's better. I don't even have to check the math, and I know this falls off way later. Especially with priming, the cold proc won't matter when you start priming, right? So it kind of is what it is, especially if you're doing like a disruption run. You're using encumber anyway. Unless you're like a Felarx bro or like a Fenmore bro, right? And you're using, what is it, Devouring Attrition? Other than that, any and all crit chance and crit damage are welcome. So it's a nice little further primer. You know, that's basically what it is. But the arcane, I see it mostly as like a flex slot. So if you, where normally you're trying to roll like a crit chance, crit damage Riven at a minimum, you could do like a crit damage melee Riven and just swap out the crit damage mod for a base damage mod on the build, and change the arcane over to frostbite. And I think that's just kind of where this arcane's gonna sit. But it's nice. The status changes, they feel pretty good, provided you want crit damage and crit chance on your weapon, and it doesn't seem to hurt. Uh, it doesn't seem to hurt slash too bad, because multi-shot and crit damage both help you so much. So it just doesn't seem like it hurts you that much. So it is what it is. It'll bring you up to like 4 multi-shots, so it is what it is. Anyway, guys, I hope this helped. I know I rambled a little bit. Everybody enjoy TennoCon. Y'all have a blessed day. Take it easy, dudes.